Every shoe you have ever owned exists, in some indirect but very real sense, because of a bottleneck one immigrant machinist solved almost entirely alone, working with parts he scavenged from junkyards and factory scrap heaps in a corner of someone else's shoe factory that he had to talk his way into using in the first place. He solved it in his mid-20s, with no formal engineering training and barely serviceable English. He was dead by 36, having profited from it only modestly, most of the real money going to the investors who backed him, rather than to the man who actually built the thing. And the company built on top of his invention went on to control the machines behind the overwhelming majority of every shoe manufactured in the United States for more than half a century, survived one federal antitrust lawsuit outright at the Supreme Court, lost a second one so significant that law students still study the ruling today, kept fighting variations of the same legal battle for another 2 decades after that, armed itself for a world war in between, and finally disappeared into an unrelated hardware conglomerate that most people have actually heard of, for an entirely different reason. This is the story of the United Shoe Machinery Corporation, and of the forgotten man whose single mechanical breakthrough made a monopoly of that scale possible in the first place, decades before anyone in a Boston boardroom had ever heard his name. That man was Ernst Matzeliger, born September 15, 1852, in Paramaribo, in what was then Dutch Guiana, now Suriname. His father was a Dutch engineer sent by the colonial government to oversee machine shops there. His mother was a Surinamese woman of African descent who had been enslaved. Matzeliger began learning machine work at 10 years old, effectively apprenticed under his own father's supervision in those same government shops, absorbing the fundamentals of mechanical work years before most boys his age would have had any exposure to a working machine at all. And by his late teens, he had gone to sea as a sailor before eventually making his way to the United States in 1873, arriving with almost nothing beyond a working knowledge of machinery and a determination to build a life somewhere that might actually reward that knowledge. He settled in Lynn, Massachusetts, a city that by the end of the century would have more than 230 shoe factories, turning out over 1 million pairs of shoes a day. Already the undisputed center of American shoe manufacturing, and exactly the kind of place where a machinist with an unusual idea about the trade might actually find both the raw materials and the potential customers he needed, and took work in one of those factories, spending his evenings teaching himself English well enough to get by in a trade in a country that were both still entirely foreign to him, and eventually operating a Mackay stitching machine, one of the earlier pieces of mechanized shoemaking equipment already in wide use across the trade. He spoke broken English at best throughout his working life and had no formal engineering credentials of any kind. Nothing beyond what his father had shown him as a boy, and what he had picked up watching and working alongside other machinists on factory floors since arriving in America. What he had, watching that factory floor day after day for years, was a very specific observation that nobody with more formal training and more capital had managed to act on. Nearly every step of making a shoe had already been mechanized by the 1870s and 1880s, except one. That one remaining step was called lasting, and it was, by a wide margin, the hardest part of the entire process to hand off to a machine. Lasting means pulling the leather upper of a shoe down tightly around a rigid form called a last, shaped roughly like a foot, and securing it there with exactly the right tension, so the leather stretches smoothly around every curve without wrinkling, tearing, or leaving a loose gap anywhere along the edge before it can be permanently attached to the sole. A skilled human laster did this entirely by feel, judging the leather's give and adjusting the pull by hand around a complex three-dimensional curve that varied slightly with every single piece of natural material, work that required real physical strength, real dexterity, and years of trained judgment that no fixed mechanical linkage of the era could easily replicate, since a machine built to handle one exact shape would simply fail the moment the leather behaved even slightly differently than expected, tearing or bunching in ways a human hand would have instinctively corrected for. It was slow, it was expensive, and because it could not be mechanized, The hand lasters in a shoe factory held an unusual amount of leverage over their employers, a genuine bottleneck they were well aware they personally controlled. They were among the highest paid workers on the factory floor, commanding wages far above most of their fellow workers on the same production line. And when they organized or went on strike, an entire factory's production could grind to a complete halt within days, since nothing downstream in the process could proceed until the lasting itself was finished, giving a comparatively small number of skilled men outsized bargaining power over factory owners, who otherwise controlled everything else about the operation. Matzeliger decided to solve it anyway, on his own time, with almost no resources and no institutional backing of any kind. He persuaded a local shoemaking firm, the Beal Brothers, to give him a corner of their shop and permission to use their machine tools after hours. And from there, he spent roughly 2 years hunting through junkyards and factory scrap piles for usable parts, adapting broken pieces of other, unrelated machines to build the mechanism he had worked out in his head. Unable to afford new components or a proper machine shop of his own, he filed for a patent on January 24, 1882, and received it on March 20, 1883, patent number 274,207, for a machine that could hold a shoe on its last, pull and pleat the leather smoothly around the heel and toe, drive in the fastening nails, and discharge a finished, lasted shoe automatically. An entire skilled craftsman's job compressed into one continuous mechanical cycle, running in a fraction of the time a human hand would have needed. A public demonstration on May 29, 1885, lasted 75 pairs of shoes in a single showing, a genuine record at the time that drew attention from across the trade, and later, more refined production versions of the machine could last as many as 700 pairs of women's shoes in a single day, roughly 5 times what an experienced human laster could manage working entirely by hand across an equivalent shift. Matzeliger's machine did not simply speed up one step in a longer process. It broke the one genuine bottleneck standing between shoemaking as a skilled handcraft and shoemaking as a fully mechanized, continuous industrial process. He did not have the capital to manufacture and sell the machine himself. A young immigrant machinist with no personal wealth and no established reputation in an industry that had every reason to be skeptical of an outsider's claim to have solved its hardest remaining problem. So he sold his patent rights to a group of investors, principally George A. Brown and Sidney W. Winslow, in exchange for shares of stock rather than cash. And the backers organized the Consolidated Lasting Machine Company, later restructured as the Consolidated Mackay Lasting Machine Company, to build and lease the invention out to shoe factories across the country. The company grew explosively almost immediately, exactly the kind of runaway commercial success that so often eludes the actual inventor behind it once outside capital and professional management take over the business side of things. Matzeliger did not get to watch much of that growth happen. In the summer of 1887, only a couple of years after his public demonstration, he fell seriously ill, first assuming it was an ordinary cold, before it was confirmed as tuberculosis. He kept tinkering with further inventions and painting as a hobby from his sickbed, as his health declined steadily over the following 2 years, refusing to fully set aside his mechanical curiosity, even as tuberculosis slowly overtook him, and he died on August 24, 1889, in Lynn, Massachusetts, at 36 years old, roughly a decade before the company built on his invention would become one of the largest and most legally significant industrial monopolies in American history. A scale of success he never lived to see even the beginning of. In February 1899, the company descended from Matzeliger's lasting machine, merged with 2 other major shoe machinery firms. The Goodyear Shoe Machinery Company, built around a stitching process invented for attaching a shoe's sole using a reinforcing strip of leather called a welt, sewn through the upper, the insole, and that welt strip all at once, which produced a more durable, resolable shoe than cheaper methods and could be repaired rather than discarded when it eventually wore out. A process named for its connection to Charles Goodyear Jr., son of the rubber vulcanization pioneer whose own name would end up on tires rather than shoes, and the McKay Shoe Machinery Company, built around an earlier sole-stitching machine from the 1850s and 1860s. The same McKay stitcher Matzeliger himself had once operated as a factory worker before he ever built anything of his own. One of the first genuinely successful mechanizations of shoemaking, and already decades old by the time of this merger, combined into a single company called the United Shoe Machinery Company, with $25 million in authorized capital, an enormous sum for the era. The merger did something that mattered as much commercially as it did technically. It brought conflicting and complementary patents from all three lineages under one roof, letting the combined company assemble the best pieces of each into single, more capable machines, rather than leaving three separate firms locked in overlapping patent disputes and eliminating the kind of legal friction that had previously slowed the whole trade's progress. The new company also carried forward a business practice each of its constituent firms had already been using individually, and that single practice would end up mattering more to the company's ultimate legal fate than any patent or any individual machine it ever built. United did not sell its shoe machinery outright. It leased it. Under that leasing model, the company retained ownership of every single machine sitting in every factory using it, collected ongoing payments over years rather than one upfront sale price, and could write lease terms requiring a customer to use United's machines exclusively at full production capacity for a decade at a stretch, with servicing and maintenance bundled directly into the lease rather than billed separately, and often with deferred payment charges layered on top that made switching to a competitor even more expensive to contemplate. It also meant no genuine secondhand market for United's machines could ever meaningfully develop, since the company never actually sold the equipment outright in the first place, which closed off one of the easiest and cheapest paths a smaller or newer competitor might otherwise have used to get functioning machines into a shoe factory without United's direct involvement. It was, from a pure business efficiency standpoint, a remarkably elegant arrangement, one that gave United continuous visibility into exactly how much every customer was producing and continuous leverage to keep them from ever leaving. It would also become, decades later, the single most contested legal issue in the company's entire history, argued over in federal courtrooms for the better part of the 20th century. United grew at a startling pace on the strength of that model. In 1903, it began construction of a major new factory in Beverly, Massachusetts, roughly 35 miles from its Boston headquarters, a complex so large and so central to the local economy that residents simply called it the Shoe for the rest of the century, the way a single dominant employer's factory sometimes becomes shorthand for the entire industry in a town's collective vocabulary. At its peak, the company employed 9,000 workers and produced 85% of all shoemaking machines used in the United States. By 1910, it held an 80% share of the entire shoe machinery market, assets exceeding $40 million and controlling interests in foreign subsidiaries, including British United Shoe Machinery, negotiated directly with the Boston parent by a British industry executive named Charles Bennion in 1899, and headquartered at a factory in Leicester, England, that would go on to export shoe machinery to more than 50 countries across the 20th century, extending United's reach well beyond American borders alone. In 1905, the operating company was formally incorporated as the United Shoe Machinery Corporation, and in 1917 that corporation absorbed the original United Shoe Machinery Company outright, consolidating everything under one legal roof and closing out whatever remained of the original three-company structure from 1899. A monopoly this complete inevitably drew federal attention, and the first real test came in the 1910s, when the government sued United under the Sherman Antitrust Act over its leasing practices, arguing that tying customers into long, exclusive, full-capacity leases amounted to illegal restraint of trade. The case reached the Supreme Court, and in 1918, United actually won outright. The court declined to find the leasing-only model automatically illegal on its face, reasoning that a company was generally free to choose how it wanted to structure its own sales, and United kept operating almost exactly as it had before the suit was ever filed, its dominant market position fundamentally undisturbed by a federal challenge that, on paper, should have posed an existential threat. It would be nearly 3 decades before the government tried again, and this time, armed with a much larger and more carefully documented case. The outcome would be very different. Before that second reckoning arrived, the Second World War pulled United, like most major American manufacturers, into an entirely different kind of production for several years. Under a wartime script logo reading simply USMC, the company built 37mm tank guns, replacement bolts for the M1917 rifle, fuses, gun turrets, and a wide range of other ordnance and aircraft hardware, alongside whatever remained of its ordinary shoe machinery business during the war years. That wartime logo has caused a small, enduring case of mistaken identity ever since among collectors of old tools and machinery, with the United Shoe Machinery Corporation's script USMC stamp regularly confused for the United States Marine Corps, a company that spent several years making tank gun parts, sharing an abbreviation, entirely by coincidence, with one of the most recognizable military branches in the country. A mix-up that still occasionally trips up unsuspecting collectors browsing old tool auctions decades later. The government's second antitrust suit against United was filed in 1947, charging the company with monopolizing the shoe machinery trade continuously from 1923 through 1947, a period during which United had bought the shares, assets, and patents of 21 separate competing shoe machinery businesses, steadily eliminating exactly the kind of competition that might otherwise have chipped away at its dominant position. The trial itself, held in the United States District Court for Massachusetts before Judge Charles Wyzonsky, ran from May 1949 to June 1952 and produced a transcript running to more than 14,000 pages across 121 separate volumes, an almost unimaginable quantity of testimony and exhibits for a single antitrust case, even by the standards of that litigious era. Judge Wyzonsky's 1953 ruling contained a genuinely strange piece of legal reasoning that has been quoted and argued over by antitrust scholars ever since. He found that United's individual business practices had been, in his own words, honestly industrial, meaning none of them, taken one at a time, looked like predatory or coercive behavior in the way antitrust law usually condemns a company. And yet, because those honest, ordinary competitive practices had cumulatively produced and preserved an 85% share of the market for major shoe machinery, he ruled that United had illegally monopolized the industry anyway. A company found guilty of a crime built entirely out of things that were not, individually, wrongdoing at all. The remedy stopped short of the full breakup the government had originally requested, which would have forced United to divest its shoe factory supply and tanning machinery subsidiaries entirely. Instead, the decree required United to start offering its machines for outright sale, rather than lease only, shortened maximum lease terms considerably, and eliminated the full capacity and exclusivity clauses that had made leaving United's ecosystem so difficult for any shoe manufacturer to seriously contemplate. The Supreme Court affirmed the ruling in 1954. The legal fight did not end there, not by a long distance. In 1968, a private shoe manufacturer called Hanover Shoe brought its own treble damage lawsuit against United, seeking to recover damages directly rather than relying on the government to enforce the earlier ruling on the industry's behalf. And the case reached the Supreme Court, which confirmed that Judge Wyzonsky's earlier findings could be used as evidence that United's leasing practices had indeed functioned as an instrument of monopolization, not merely a neutral business choice a company happened to make. Judge Wyzonsky himself, by then a senior judge, well into his own later career, was still issuing orders in the same original case decades after his initial ruling, including a 1975 order specifically restricting United's successor company from reacquiring control of any business it had previously been ordered to divest. A full 22 years after he first decided the case, and long after most outside observers would have assumed the matter was permanently settled. Few antitrust rulings in American history have generated that kind of sustained judicial follow-through, one judge overseeing a single company's compliance across more than 2 decades of his own career. By 1968, the company had renamed itself simply USM Corporation, quietly setting aside a name that, by then, was permanently associated in the business and legal press with one of the more significant monopoly rulings of the 20th century, the kind of reputational baggage a company might reasonably want to shed, even decades after the underlying legal battles had technically concluded. In 1976, USM Corporation merged with Emhart Industries to form the Emhart Corporation, a much broader industrial conglomerate whose own roots traced back to the American hardware company, founded in New Britain, Connecticut in 1902, and whose eventual product lines would span glass bottle manufacturing equipment, packaging and filling machinery, security systems, electronics, fasteners, rubber processing equipment, and consumer hardware brands entirely unrelated to shoes, a diversification that steadily buried the old shoe machinery identity under an increasingly unrelated industrial portfolio. The historic Beverly, Massachusetts plant, the Shoe, was finally abandoned as a manufacturing site in 1986, closing out more than 8 decades of continuous shoe machinery production on that same ground. The following year, Emhart sold the actual USM shoe machinery division outright to a British firm called Abelkind Limited, which kept the USM name and relocated its administrative operations first to Wilmington, Massachusetts, and later to Farmington, Connecticut, carrying the name further and further from the company and the city that had originally built it into a household name within its own industry. Emhart itself did not remain independent much longer after finally shedding the last piece of its shoe machinery heritage. In 1989, facing a $2 billion hostile takeover attempt from a New York investment group that included the oil heir Gordon P. Getty, Emhart's management chose instead to merge with Black & Decker Corporation in a friendly deal valued at roughly $2.8 billion. A classic defensive maneuver of exactly the kind that played out across corporate America throughout the 1980s takeover era, and one that handed a company descended from one of the most consequential shoe machinery monopolies in American history over to a power tool and hardware brand most people would immediately recognize today, for an entirely unrelated reason having nothing to do with shoes or antitrust law at all. The merged operations moved to Black & Decker's headquarters in Towson, Maryland, closing Emhart's own Farmington, Connecticut offices in the process. And by 1995, the old USM shoe machinery business had been split again into 2 smaller divisions under its new corporate parent. Even the fastener and eyelet subsidiaries United had once owned outright a century earlier. Companies with names like United Fast Color Eyelet and United Awl and Needle ended up years later inside an entirely separate business called the PCI Group, a direct, traceable consequence of the antitrust remedies imposed decades earlier, still forcing United's various successors to keep loosening their grip on adjacent businesses piece by piece, long after the original ruling itself had faded from public memory. The old Beverly factory complex did not disappear entirely. In the end, even after manufacturing there finally stopped, it was purchased in 1996 by a commercial real estate firm, Cummings Properties, restored rather than demolished, and reopened as what is now called the Cummings Center, described by its own operators as among the oldest continuously used commercial real estate in the United States, its history preserved in partnership with the local historical society, rather than paved over and forgotten the way so many of this history's old factory sites eventually were. Somewhere in that restored brick complex, if you know where to look, there is still a trace of the machines that once controlled the shoes on nearly every foot in America, a physical echo of a monopoly that once ran through federal courtrooms for the better part of a century. There is, as far as the historical record shows, no comparable monument anywhere to the man whose single invention made all of it possible in the first place. Ernst Matzeliger solved the one problem an entire industry could not solve on its own, sold the rights for stock rather than cash, because stock was the only form of payment on offer to a man with no formal standing in the trade, and died at 36 without ever seeing the scale of the monopoly his idea eventually built, the decades of federal litigation it would spend defending itself in, or the strange, quotable legal paradox a judge would eventually write about a company built on his idea being guilty of monopolizing an entire American industry through practices that were, taken one at a time, entirely honest.